to climate change concerns, we have discussed that certain actions have have been assigned to be taken by the developed countries, and the key issues can be placed in four subheads like level and type of action or commitment, means of implementation, comparability of the efforts, and compliance system. So we have just discussed these aspects, various points which are related to these actions uh, in uh, last lecture. Now, let us see what actions are expected by developing countries. The main features are nationally appropriate uh, measures has to be taken in the context of sustainable development. What kind of new projects and new perspective has to be adopted at national level? It can be taken by these countries. So they have certain space, certain freedom to adopt the remediation and mitigation measure just because it is considered that the previous global warming and climate change is more uh, impacted by the industrial development and emissions of the developed countries. Their economic situation is also better, so they can go for adopting the measures, or they can go for planning for mitigation measures more effectively where funds and technologies are required. So they can support developing countries in these aspects in many ways. So the developing countries has to develop their own plans for in rather now it can be said that it should be in accordance to developing sustainable development goals set by the United Nations. So it should be supported and enabled by technology, financing, and capacity building, where developed countries can uh, support, especially they can claim support when their carbon balance is on positive side, when they are in position to go for carbon trading to certain defined countries or certain defined industries uh, in a measurable, reportable, and verifiable manner. Because the technology transfer or payments can be done by the countries with less carbon credits only if the carbon credit in extra carbon credit countries are measurable, reportable, and verifiable. It cannot be just done on assumption. So these mechanisms are required to be developed by each country who are claiming benefit of their greeneries or technological sinks for greenhouse gases and reduction of greenhouse gases in the way they want to do it through sustainable development measures, green technologies, or adoption to non-emitting industries. The initial focus of negotiations from 1995 was mitigation. So adoption identified as issue at COP 70 in 2001. Actually, it was considered that though mitigation was the focus previously, mitigation is a little bit time-taking process, and executing the mitigation related issues are really complicated. So the global community involved in these negotiations and was having concern with the climate change and its mitigation, thought that let us concentrate on adaptation in first phase in addition to mitigation remediation measures, because till the mitigation is done as expected, the adaptation should also go hand in hand, because people and the systems must adapt to whatever climate change is going on before the actual mitigation starts, or impact of the mitigation projects start taking shape and uh, making impact. The adaptation has to be the second leg of a Copenhagen agreement, equal to equal in importance to mitigation. So it was thought later in Copenhagen agreement that adaptations would also be given equal importance as mitigation has been given. And we have already discussed the various steps taken in adaptation before in previous lectures. The financial needs related to adaptations are in the order of 100 billions annually. It is a huge money. One can assume how this money will get available. That's why adaptation is also not easy. So adaptation and mitigation both has to go hand in hand. And both are equally important for the meeting out the challenges of climate change and global warming. It was realized lately. Recognition that designated financial mechanisms will be required for adoption action and also, of course, for the mitigation action. So, key issues under adoption, as we have discussed before, also are what actions would be taken, national planning, improving resilience, building up, spreading knowledge base, that is vulnerable assessment, which we have already discussed, then risk assessment, management and insurance, which we have already discussed, implementation of adaptation programs and projects, and then how to generate finance for adaptation, how to match local needs with support, access to finance, and institutional framework for adaptation and governance. So these aspects has been discussed previously also, but now we have to see it in context of mitigation too, that adaptation is equally important to mitigation, because mitigation cannot be done just in a very short time. The way things are moving, the way things are complicated, mitigation and adaptation, of course, will take time. So there should be very, very serious concern on both the aspects. Technology has to play an important role in carbon, this entire carbon business. The carbon footprints can be reduced by technological innovations, and it is key for supporting mitigation and adaptation. Developed countries to support technology transfer if they have to developing countries. The green technology, which are now coming up and which are expected to replace the emission based technologies, are now it is thought that probably they require uh, more funds and more uh, and better infrastructure. So probably developed countries may be having better technologies, and if they are under standardization or acclimatization to their conditions, it can be transferred to developing countries also. A removal of barriers to promoting technology transfer include financial, it should be including financial, intellectual property rights, tariff and non-tariff, and capacity building. So actually, we had a series of negotiations and adaptations at global level when economy was getting open and market-based industrial economy was adopted. It was told that the world is a global village, and then there should be free access to technology, and there should be free access to sell. And during that process, in fact, this process harmed a lot. The It created a lot of additional emission, because in competition to reduce the cost of the products, overproduction was done by most of the countries, developed countries. Most of the industries, they produce substances, produced items in much quantity what was required just to bring down the prices. It utilized resources. It emitted a lot more what was required, but the advocates of that global economy and open economy were largely the governments, governance people, and economists. So they did not listen the cry of environmentalists by that time also. But now, global uh, climate change and global warming has created a space where everyone has to listen it. These financial activities cannot go now in the way they planned because of climate change and its impact on all the sectors where economy is driving. So these barriers have to be removed for technology transfers, and some mechanism for financing intellectual property rights, tariffs and non-tariffs, and capacity building have to be developed. Ways to accelerate deployment, diffusion and transfer of technology has to be evolved. Cooperation on research and development has to be established. Effectiveness of tools and mechanisms for technology cooperation is required to be framed very effectively now. So, the finance generation of new and additional adequate, predictable and sustainable funding will be required, which include innovative sources for adaptation, mobilization of public and private sector finances towards climate remediation and mitigation projects, and also under this adaptation and mitigation projects both comes, access to finance is required to be set set up and to be structured, which include improved access to existing financial resources, positive incentives to implement mitigation, adaptation, carbon business, and technology transfer. Mechanisms for matching needs with support is required, and institutional arrangements for finance and investment is required. Scientific and political context for climate change negotiations are very important. Without that, the process cannot be effectively implemented. Uh, Overview of the negotiations from Kyoto to Copenhagen has to be understood very clearly to draw a structured planning and to understand what is going on in the adaptation and mitigation to negative impacts of climate change. Main issues in the post 2012 negotiations has to be understood, and outcomes of Copenhagen and outlook of Cancun have to be analyzed, and United Nations framework for carbon CCC Secretariat in supporting the negotiations is required. So Copenhagen Accord was the real action on mitigation. It had target to keep global temperature below 2%, 2 degrees centigrade. So deep cuts in global greenhouse gas emission was rather imposed, with peaking as soon as possible, longer in developing countries, but as soon as it is possible, it should be adopted in developed countries. It was a motive All parties commit to implement quantified economy-wide emissions target for 2020. Kyoto parties to strengthen implementation of the protocol, and then financing to be as per measurable, reportable, and variable systems. Non-AI parties uh, will implement mitigation actions. It was decided subject to domestic MRV and reporting through national communication every 2 years will be done, and supported actions are subject to international MRV and recording in this registry. So it was also decided to immediately establish a RED plus mechanism. So world greenhouse gas emissions are not only CO2, though we represent it as carbon sequestration or carbon emission in a general term, it has other gases too. So uh, even CO2, a large quantum of CO2, 59%, is supposed to emit from industries, uh, then 18% from respiration of agricultural and wetlands and forests, uh, 8% nitrous oxide gases are emitted, and 40% chlorofluorocarbons. So in sub-Sahara countries, 20%, but the country-wise this is uh, changed. This is world average. This is average for sub-Sahara countries, where you can just see a minor change in the figures. Then here, sector-wise emissions has been predicted, where you can see that industry is emitting around 20%, residential and commercial buildings are emitting about 8%, transport is emitting about 13% at global level, energy supply, largely thermal power based systems of for electricity production are emitting around 26%, the highest amongst all. Agriculture is also emitting about 13%. Forestry is emitting about 17%. And wastewater and waste decomposition is emitting about 2.8%. So they have energy supply, transport, building, industry, agriculture, forestry, and waste. They all have potential to contributing the greenhouse gases, and we have to identify their ratio, their sites, from where they are emitting, and where we can make certain uh, checks and balances. For that this detail is required. So then there is low carbon path and high carbon path. High carbon path have more greenhouse gas emissions, and low carbon path has less greenhouse gas emissions. So this is considered as green path, low carbon path, which has to be adopted through sustainable development goals, and we have to come back from high carbon path to low carbon path in our developmental pathways. So behavior and waste, efficiency, renewable energy, and red uh, plus and sequestration mechanisms are going to shift us from high carbon path to low carbon path. So these aspects are required to be taken very carefully. So the mitigation uh, towards a low carbon development path require to promote low carbon technologies, energy efficiency systems, renewable energy, low carbon urban transport, sustainable management, land use changes, and forestry, and enabling activities and capacity building. So these are various global environmental facility which has to be promoted. The goals has been fixed for these global environmental facilities so that climate change mitigation uh, should be there, and the support countries should move towards a low carbon development pathways. So promote energy efficiency is required, and most of the, you can see in our system also, we have shifted from bulbs to CFLs, and now we are moving to LEDs, where very significant cut in consumption of electricity there. Then efficient energy chulhas has been produced for rural areas where green gas is not supplied for cooking. So policy, legal, and regulatory frameworks are required. Sustainable financing mechanisms are required, and funds are to be generated. So policy and regulatory framework should be there for renewable energy. Increased investment in renewable energy technologies are required for mitigation. Legal and regulatory framework for from sustainable urban transport is required, and increased investment in sustainable transport is required, because transport is also a very important sector where a lot of emissions are there. So conservation and enhancement of carbon stock through land use management is required. So good management practices are required for land use. Restoration and enhancement of carbon stocks in forest and non-forest land is required. Uh, Supports enabling activities and capacity building is required. Here, national communications and other obligations under the UNFCCC is required, and countries can also receive support from for vulnerability and adaptation assessment, capacity building, and technology needs assessment. So this is basically the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has a lot of mechanisms in it, so it has to be strengthened. The mitigation and carbon finance is very important aspect of this mitigation. So here, capacity building to help create enabling legal and regulatory environment is required. Support of programmatic carbon finance and other activities under the post 2012 climate regime is required. Demonstration is required for technical and financial viability of the technologies. Partial risk guarantees and contingent financing for carbon finance projects are required, and co-financing of innovative projects with credit to be retained in the recipient country for further project application. So remediation measures of climate change includes reduction in consumption of fossil fuels such as coal and petroleum, use of biogas plants, use of nuclear power plants, increasing forest cover, use of unleaded petrol in automobiles, installation of pollution controlling devices in automobiles and industry. So there can be so many things, but stepwise, where we are standing, we have to move further. All levels of government must act to eliminate the combustion of fossil fuels, regardless to the perceived cost and economic consequences. All new buildings and new electricity generation plants should be designed to operate without fossil fuel. All levels of government must accept the reality that non-fossil fuel energy costs much more than fossil fuel energy before fossil carbon tax. But that non-fossil fuel energy is essential for a survive the emerging crisis of global warming. In order to encourage the development of additional non-fossil fuel electricity generation, the price of non-peak electricity must be increased. The price of electricity must be based on the cost per kilowatt of non-fossil fuel electricity. As long as fossil fuel are used to minimize the end user's cost of electricity, it is impossible to attract sufficient private investment in non-fossil fuel electricity generation to replace existing and future fossil fuel electricity generation. The government should implement a fossil carbon tax that is sufficiently high that it does not make financial sense to use fossil carbon as a fuel for supply of primary energy. It is reasonably estimated that this tax must be about $200 per emitted per ton of carbon dioxide. Part of carbon tax revenue should go to parties that produce bicarbon and methanol. Bicarbon is the solid carbon rich material that remains after pyrolysis, heating in absence of oxygen or biomatter. So pyrolysis strips up the water component of plant carbohydrate. Methanol is can be done. Methanol results from heating carbohydrate in a hydrogen atmosphere. So these kind of measures, these kind of chemical technology has to be developed. Increasing population is a major cause of increasing demand for energy. All governments must implement effective measures to stabilize and then reduce the worldwide human population. This is very important. If governments fail to promptly deal with this matter, naturally forces will cause population erosion via war, famine, floods, and disease. All countries should tighten law and enforcement relating to emission of greenhouse gases and ozone-depleting substances. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency that recommends that changing out standard light bulbs for compact fluorescent bulbs or LED lights, which use up to 75% less energy and last longer. So it is now most of the countries are adopting LED in place of other light sources. The this Environmental Protection Agency of United States also recommend buying Energy Star certified products which are designed to be efficient and last longer. So market is also flooded with Energy Star certified devices. To reduce the emission, change your driving habits. The easiest way to cut carbon emission is to drive less, carpool to work, take public transportation, walk on a ride or bike. So we have to go for some self-control also. So Kyoto Protocol is an amendment to the United States Framework Convention on Climate Change. Uh, and it was UNFCCC, an intentional treaty on global warming, has a lot of mechanisms for reducing the carbon emission. The countries which ratify this protocol commit to reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide and five other greenhouse gases. A total of 141 countries have ratified the agreement. Notable exceptions include the United States and Australia, who did not agree to the protocol. So, temperature increase has to be reduced. The temperature is increasing and area of ice is decreasing. This is scenario which Kyoto Protocol recognized and adopted the measures. So UN framework on climate change says that research on the promotion, development and increased use of new and renewable forms of energy, of carbon dioxide, sequestration, technologies and of advanced and innovative environmentally sound technologies are required. Encouragement of appropriate reforms in relevant sectors aimed at promoting policies and measures which limit or reduce emissions of greenhouse gases not controlled by the Montreal Protocol. Then limitation and a reduction of methane emission through recovery and use in waste management as well as in the production, transport and distribution of energy. So these are certain points which was made as key points in UN framework on climate change. The Climate Stewardship Act was implemented. It says it was first introduced in the Senate in 2003 and reintroduced in February 2005 in United States. It would reduce carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbon, and perfluorocarbons, which are released by power plants at 2000 levels by 2010. So, what was level at 2000 has to be brought in 2010. It was the target of this stewardship act. The bill reduces the risk of global warming without hurting the economy. Though this kind of situations are really very complex, and we cannot reduce the risk of global warming without changing a pathway